The market update. So this is a general overview, and I don't really want to ruin the presentation, but these are some of the themes that you will see and probably are well known to most of you anyway. But the secondary market is strong, or the market is strong across both new and secondary, and that's underpinned by the tight supply and high demand, and that confidence is high, and there's plenty of access to capital. And no doubt most of you are well aware that there is it appears as though there's a bit of a battle for market share at the moment, which means that people are buying equipment, or banks that I'm aware of are actually encouraging people to go out and buy assets at the moment. And why wouldn't you? Everything is typically in our space is going up. And so, as most of you will know, we talk about road transport because most of us are involved in that in one way or another. It makes up most of your books, but we will touch on earth-moving agriculture, and then we'll finish off on auto again, because most of you will be coming across that in your daily lives, if not in your professional lives as well. And so, when we talk about road transport, again, the pattern is that we talk about the heavy, the medium, and the light duty, and so we normally start off in the new truck sales. I'll let you guys read the points on the screen. I'm not going to read them to you because that's not as much fun for you guys, but I'll just talk in the background. And so the two biggest years to date in truck sales have been 2008, and that had just shy of it was 8,270 odd units, and then the next year it took us 10 years to beat that, which was in 2018, and that was just shy of 8,700 units. And so we're going to talk to year-to-date numbers, but at the moment we are on track to beat both of those. So it took 10 years to beat the 2008 record, and it's now only 4 short years later, and we're going to be beating it again. So what impact does that have for all of us? And we'll talk about some of the predictions for this market in the future. So year to date, the first quarter we are ahead on those two previous record years, which is pretty phenomenal considering that there is the federal election and there are some headwinds which are starting to face the transport industry. But most of you will know that normally when it hits a federal election, everyone goes into a bit of a standby mode, and there's no real decisions which are made. That's all delayed for post-election. This year, or this election cycle, it just doesn't appear like that same normality is there, where I don't know whether it's the lack of major policy initiative from either side or whatnot, but it just seems like business is going on as usual. There's no real interruption, and if anything, it's more other factors outside the federal election, being interest rates, fuel prices, whatnot, that are having a bit more of an impact on confidence and those things, which I find to be really interesting. Some of the, I suppose, those headwinds which I will talk about are the new supply. So even though we're on track for the biggest record, and we've had the factories of Kenworth and Volvo, they've built their ability to scale up their production, and I'll show you some of the numbers shortly. But they are well and truly above where they would normally be as far as year-to-date numbers, but we're still not meeting that supply. If you look at the fuel price from late last year, it's gone up about 60%, which is pretty significant when you're running up and down the highway and you're burning a lot of fuel. That's a 60% increase. The other thing which is not as well known is that the fuel rebate which the big transport operators or the transport operators are allowed to use, and they typically that fuel rebate is then offset against their GST account. That has been removed to pay for the fuel excise production to reduce the 20 cents which they've reduced that fuel price, which we all enjoy. That's come at a cost of these guys. That's where the federal government has funded it, which is really, really interesting. A lot of people may not be aware of it, and so when they come to their BAS. That's going to be pretty interesting to see how that is rolled out as well as management. So just to put these numbers into perspective, pre-COVID, Volvo was actually looking at becoming the number one manufacturer, and they were beating Kenworth on some months, which historically has never happened. Kenworth has been the number one performer for a long time. Now we can see that Isuzu have leapfrogged Volvo as a brand into second place, which is really interesting, and I didn't think I'd ever see it happen. And that is due to some of the supply chain issues that Volvo is facing. They built their factory and their capability, but it's not all bad news. You look at the bottom three of the top five, which is Volvo, Mack, and UD, and they're all part of the Volvo Australia group. So they're doing a terrific job as a collective, and no doubt that those numbers will come back. The demand for Volvos is exceptionally high. You place an order now and you'll get it in 2023, and the same with Kenworth. And so I'll look at the Kenworth numbers only, but the 2020 numbers and the 2021 year-to-date numbers, you look at it now, 647, they were 398, then 497, and now 647. So you can see that they've had that year-on-year increase, and it's not just an incremental, 5 or 10%. It is significant from last year to this year, and no doubt they're thoroughly enjoying the fact that they made the decision to boost their production capability out of Melbourne. So, and those numbers are replicated through a lot of the manufacturers, which is quite interesting. The medium duty, so medium and light duty, there is delays on getting these types of trucks as well. So you can be given a delivery date for your truck, and then when you get your truck, you then take it to the bodybuilder, and I'll talk about that in the used trucks, but the bodybuilders are also experiencing significant delays. So if you've been given a delivery date of, say, August, September, for instance, you get it, and then you think, oh yeah, well, this is only, I'll have my truck by the end of the year. It's potentially not the case because the bodies aren't actually available. Interestingly, you can see Iveco there at 26 units year to date. Iveco have actually pulled out of their Australian manufacturing, so they're exiting as a manufacturer from Australia, but they are still selling their product. And I think there's a larger focus on the European models rather than the ACO and the Australian built product. So that's going to be interesting with what happens with that manufacturing. That ACO product, which they did use, which was primarily used in the garbage compactor space, they've had some other entrants come to that, so they've been under attack in that market for a long time. In the light duty, again, this is that last mile delivery space. Again, we've spoken about this a number of times, and this is going to continue to go gangbusters. Most of us know that buyer behaviour has changed significantly to the online model. So light trucks and vans being all that delivery is continuing to go really strong. Isuzu, you'll note, and I'll just go back to that previous slide, Isuzu are by far the dominant player in these two sectors. They've got really good dealership service models. So your downtime, if you do need to take it in, they are the Toyota of trucks. They're really reliable. Their service is brilliant. The product is really good, and I don't see any of the other manufacturers catching up anytime soon because they're too strong at the moment, and I don't think that'll change. So the secondary sales, and I'll spend a little bit of time on this. So if you place an order for a new truck, there is it can be up to 12 to 18 months to get a new one. If you've got a specialist build, you will go to the back of the queue for that, which means the operators in Western Australia, for instance, they have a different configuration. They use an 8x4 prime mover, where predominantly on the East Coast we use a 6x4, which is one axle less, and it's easy to get through the production line. If you need a truck in with that specification, you've always typically had to wait. Just that wait time now is far greater than what you were used to. with these heavy truck space, if you normally run your fleet from say 1 to 4 or 5 years, and you have it running to 800 to 1 million kilometres in that time frame, it's a relatively common model. You run it that 5 years, you then replace your 10 trucks or your 50 trucks, whatever it is, or you might replace 5 or 10 a year over that period. If you haven't got your order in, which is common, and what we're probably going to see, so the operator can't replace in that normal replacement cycle which they do run, they're going to have to extend the life from say 800 to 1 million kilometres out to 1 million to 1.2 or 3 or 4 while they're waiting for that new truck. And what that means is if you've got those 10 trucks which you do need to replace, and there's now that extra time frame which you hadn't thought of when you ordered them 4 years ago, which is easy to do, there's a rebuild cost on an engine which is sort of $50,000 to $60,000. You put that across your 10 trucks, then you've got a $500,000 or $600,000 unscheduled or unplanned maintenance schedule. If you run it beyond that, then you might be doing clutches or transmissions, and so that $500,000 could easily start to add up to significantly more, which is going to be really, really interesting. How the operators and management deal with that unplanned maintenance or unscheduled maintenance. So you look at some of the, I know I keep talking about the headwinds, but the headwinds which the transport operators are facing, which is high fuel prices, no reduction or no rebate. You've got potentially the unplanned maintenance, and then you've got this continued shortage of drivers, which I know we've been presenting about for the last sort of 4 years, and it's just exacerbated even further now. You can't get your drivers, so you can't operate at full capacity. And I think that there's these headwinds which we need to be aware of. I don't think it's a death bell. I don't think the market's going to change anytime soon as a result to say, oh, well, prices are going to decrease. I don't think that's the case. There is still a lot of positives in this industry too, which is increase in the demand across all sectors, including consumer behaviour. So the transport running up and down the highway is going to continue. There is still relatively cheap access to capital and buying new. The trouble obviously is the supply, but there is still really high confidence in that market. A couple of the things which I find interesting in a market like the one we're facing, which is that really tight supply and really high demand, is a lot of that doesn't actually reach into, say, the auction houses, which you would think is the perfect way to sell an asset with high demand and short supply, because it starts to play on the factors of availability, the buyer endorsement effect when you see other people bidding. You need to make sure that if you've got a truck which has got that unplanned maintenance and you just need to buy one to fulfill a contract or whatever it happens to be. But it seems to be that they get sucked into the market prior to them reaching the auction houses. And there's always these little waves that hit the transport sector, whether it is the increase in interest rates, increase in fuel prices, just hard to find drivers. There's a lot of regulation which happens, particularly in the heavy vehicles. There's a lot of regulation, and there can be these little incremental changes which add up to an operator. It's almost like a death by 1,000 cuts, just going, all right, I've had enough, I'm going to sell my fleet and just retire, or I don't want the stress, or whatever it may be. And so those things in these sorts of markets don't actually translate into auctions as much as what I think they probably should, because you will get a much higher return via auction. Anyway, it's just something which I find interesting and just something to comment on. I want to talk about a couple of snapshots now of different sales which we've run. A lot of you will probably recognize this slide, and that's we designed it that way intentionally to sort of highlight the way in which the market is moving on. This is a sale that we ran halfway through 2021. It was just before harvest. It's all Kenworth product, which, as you know, is the #1 product in the market. It was in regional New South Wales. The lot number 8 there is the one which I always like to reference, because it's at the time it was a 6-year-old truck, and it sold for 60% of new price, not 60% of its current retail price, but 60% of new. So the old adage of 5 years 30 or 5 years 40, which a lot of banks use as a lending policy on transport, that is 6 years and 60%, which is just phenomenal. And so we then look at a sale again. This is December 2021, but this is another fleet which did make it to auction that we did sell, and I just think it's a good one to reflect on, to go, all right, well, it's roughly sort of 6 months apart from that first sale. This was part of a construction company. It was their transport division. They decided that it was a non-core asset, and a bit like I mentioned before with some of those headwinds and the fuel prices were going up, drivers were hard to get, and they just went, this is a non-core asset. Why are we putting effort into this? Let's shut down the fleet. They had a few people who were trying to buy it before it actually reached us, and because of that level of activity, they actually decided we don't want to deal with this. We're going to put it to auction. All of you can contact the Slatteries, and this is how it'll sell. I want to point out the lot number 1 and 2. They were current year model. So trucks were delivered within 2021, and they were bringing that near new price. I have no doubt that if we sold this package or this package again now, that all of those trucks would sell for higher percentages than what they had done in 2021, just because it is, again, much tighter than what it has been in the past. People just want the assets so that they can deploy them straight away. I'll draw your attention to lot number 8 again, which is that trailer that sold for 100% of new price. A lot of what we talk about is trucks, but we don't spend a lot of time talking about trailers, because the transport market is huge. The prime movers are just an easy way to talk about the wider sentiment and what is happening. To talk about the trailer market, you really need to break it down into all the different sectors within that, and it's probably a much more in-depth session, and you can spend sort of an hour just on trailers alone and the different drivers for each of those segments. But this is a bit of a standout. Just like the trucks, the delivery time for trailers has really blown out. And in some instances, if you're looking for a heavy haulage trailer, for instance, you're not going to get it until the end of 2023. There's some new manufacturers popping up. And as you know, anything that is new, it normally takes a bit of time to build an order book and those things. But in the heavy haulage market, a new manufacturer is turning up, and they've got their delivery times blown out to the middle of 2023. Just because people need the trailers, and they will buy them if they're available. So for those of you who did sign in a little late, you're more than welcome to ask questions. Send them through either in the chat box or direct to my mobile if you've got my number, and we will try and answer anything as we go. So moving into civil and earth moving, this again is affected by global supply. Typically we use Caterpillar as a really good barometer. For those of you who aren't familiar with this market, Caterpillar have a product in almost every single range. They are either number 1 or number 2 within almost every single product that they're in. If they're not in a particular area, whether it be, say, forestry or certain sectors of mining, they will then go and buy either number 1 or number 2, sometimes number 3, and then build it into being either number 1 or 2. So they've got this full product offering, which a lot of the other manufacturers just don't have. So that's why we use them as a bit of a guiding light as to what's happening in this industry. And so you look at them, and globally they've had their revenues increasing. For a manufacturer, it's really, really, really impressive. They've got different factories all over the world. Some of them are better than others, but overall, they have a really, really, really good product and really well supported. You can go and buy what's called a grey import, so it may not be Australian delivered. You can buy something from, say, South Africa, the Middle East, America, whatever it happens to be, and the dealers have to, as part of the deal agreement, they have to service it in Australia, which is something which is really unique. Other manufacturers wouldn't do it, but it's part of why their products remain number one or number two, because you can still get the parts for them regardless of where you get the machine. So because they are manufactured offshore, the fluctuation in the dollar really does impact what we do as buyers in the Australian market, whether we wait for new or go and get it from, say, the US. You do have to be careful with importing certain machines because of the different emission standards of the different countries. It's just something that you need to be aware of if you do have a client who is importing machines, and a quick phone call can sort of let you know what's happening. In the same sense, if we're exporting machines, you can't just export a machine and hope that it's going to work in another market. There is a fair amount of risk that's attached to it. So why is this market doing so well? And that is because of the infrastructure spend. So we then look at, is the election changing things? In this market, it is, because everyone, it just seems to be flavour of the month with all levels of government at the moment promise major infrastructure work, and we'll get it done, and the cheap capital, whatever it happens to be. And you can see here that the change in all states is all green. They're all increasing their spending, and it's significant already. So this slide will be outdated already because of the election promises. I know that there's just been another $2 billion promised for another project by the Liberal government. So that will no doubt be matched or countered or changed to a degree by the Labor government. So that's where that's the cycle that we're in. I particularly like this slide because it links the infrastructure spending to the project and the state. No doubt lots of you have seen this, and again, it's just interesting. It's not something that we've generated. You'll be able to Google this slide if you do like it, but you can see that there is major projects happening all over the country. New South Wales probably has the majority of that, but that'll be matched with future spending in Victoria. I think their election's happening next year, so that will change. But all this infrastructure spending does then lead to confidence in the secondary market. So that new tightness of supply obviously leads into how that secondary market demand and availability. So what I find particularly interesting at the moment is we've got this situation where there's lots of flooding, and when there's lots of flooding, there's generally the cleanup operations, and then there's a lot of yellow gear which is used within those operations. And so you think, all right, well, cleanup operations usually means a mini boom at the end of the rain event, and that is the case. So there is a lot of work, but the more it rains, the less time that these operators can operate their machines, and so they charge these machines out at an hourly rate. And if they can't then charge that time, or they can't operate those or get those hours into the machines, then they can't provide the invoices. So the more rain that there is, the more tightness in performance that there also generates. But if you're then going, all right, well, we've got underperforming here, or an underperforming client who's in the earth moving game, then you look at the assets and go, well, actually, the LVRs are still fine because these things are actually appreciating because they can't use them and you can't get new machines in. So if you do have clients that are underperforming in this space, then no doubt they'll probably be able to ride it out. But if they don't, they can still sell the assets and probably get out of it anyway, because the demand is almost insatiable in this space, depending on the product and the market. But overall, I know it's a broad brush statement, overall, this market is performing very, very well. We've got a snapshot on these graders, and you look at the return in, so lot 5, 6, and 7. You look at that because of the rain, and the graders are very much affected by the weather. If you've got droughts or long spells of dry periods, that means that the roads are pretty good. When there's lots of rain or intermittent rain, the roads and the potholes, we all know that they start to emerge after the rain. So you think back over the last sort of 8 months, there's been a lot of rain, a lot of roads washed away. So again, we sold this snapshot is from December, but that then shows the confidence leading into Q1. If we sold those machines again now, I again have no doubt that those percentage increases, 57, 51, that would absolutely go up to probably 60, 65%. I'm not brave enough to say 70, but I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case. So what we're finding is that there are going to be more. We've got a package of gear which is run from a council. This council has decided that they can outsource it quicker and cheaper than what they can run internally. So they're going to be selling a package of gear, and a lot of it is sort of less than 2,000 hours or 5,000 hours, but there are a number of machines that are 2,000 hours. So it's going to be really interesting. So we'll put that in the next quarterly update, how that sale fares. But we do think that those things are going to, those machines will bring 100% or greater than new price. So keep an eye out for that. So I haven't had any questions sent through to me yet. Feel free to send them through if you like, or wait to the end, either way. But please feel comfortable in asking questions. Happy to answer whatever we can. So again, you guys no doubt have probably read all of that last year. Sorry, this last slide. What we're seeing is continued confidence in the agri sector. The property prices, the beast prices, everything is going really, really strong. I'm really interested to find out if we're getting close to harvest. The rain is really, really, really important. I'm really interested to see what happens with this year's harvest in particular and the prices as a result, because one of the major drivers of global price is the wheat harvest out of Ukraine and Russia. Obviously, there's a couple of issues over there at the moment, so we will be looking to see what happens with that wheat price and the wheat yields coming out of this season. So you look at Australia and you think, oh, we're a really big ag player. We've got 4 billion in machinery sales, so that must mean that we get a fair bit of attention. It doesn't. We are not a major player. On some of the larger pieces, we are a bit more important, but overall, we're too small a market. We get our allocation, and outside that allocation, we just need to wait until the next allocation. So there has, depending on seasons, always been a bit of a lag time, but it is far greater now than what it has been in the past. So again, you look at that leading new price sale versus secondary market, and the secondary market is really strong. Ag gear is quite seasonal, most of you know that, but it is becoming less seasonal just based on availability. You can order a new machine, and again, a bit like the bodybuilders and even the trucks, which we spoke about, you can order a new machine and you might have a delivery date of later this year and you've been waiting 6 months already. What is becoming more and more common is the machines get put on a ship, or your asset, whatever it happens to be, gets put on a ship, and then for some unknown reason, most likely that there's a better margin to transport a different asset, they just unload your asset and it's sitting on a dock which you didn't even know the ship was stopping at. So I just had more of a comment texted through to me rather than a question, so thank you for that. So that is then blowing out the supply of, or the delivery times of, certain assets. So there has been a bit of a change in some of the ag OH&S requirements, which means that quad bikes are no longer fit into the corporate farming OH&S policy. So they're out of flavour, they're out of fashion, which means that their market value has decreased. They're only getting bought into, say, hobby farms or family operations, and they're now being replaced with what's called side-by-sides, all those buggies which have the seat belts, roll cages and whatnot. And so there's going to be an increased demand for those, and obviously the second-hand values of quad bikes being OH&S risk are no longer acceptable. And that's been happening over the last 6 months, but it's now it's far more common. Workers, we all know a lot of industries are affected by this. The seasonal workers, the borders opening is obviously will alleviate some of the issues in that seasonal workers. Last year, the borders were closed. It was far harder to do it. There was a bit of a pivot where they were getting some of the aviation sector to go and work and drive headers and tractors and whatnot. And so you've got a pilot who's obviously really well trained into risk mitigation, understanding machines and maintenance, obviously piloting the vehicles. So there was a transition from that last year. Aviation firing back up, those workers won't be available to the farmers, and they'll have to go back to that seasonal backpacker type worker. So interesting to see how that's going to play out. But again, I think it's going to be a little bit interesting for the farmers. I think overall they will perform quite well. So we'll get into automotive. I won't spend a massive amount of time on this, just because whilst it impacts all of us, it's not make or break unless you're doing sort of major fleets. But we are still plagued by supply chain issues. Interestingly, in the March figures, you'll see that Tesla jumps into the top 5. And so the first point there, what they've done is they've put all their year-to-date numbers into March, because they've only just started reporting with VFAX. So you can see this is the top 10. They've dropped all their numbers into March, the March sales, which makes them look outstanding. So their March figures are 3,042 or whatever they happen to be, and then their April figures are about 50. So it's a much more normalized number, but it is interesting to see that they are reporting for the first time. What I find as a bit of a call out here is number 10, the MG. The Chinese manufacturer bought the brand, has released it in Australia, and it's now in the top 10, and it is increasing. So you get what you're given, you sort of know what you're getting into. It's cheap, it's reliable, it's a good little runabout car at a better price point than some of the others. And so that's going to more than likely follow the trend of, say, the Kias and the Hyundais, where there will be a far greater acceptance, and they will improve their product over time. So I just wanted to explain this next slide a little bit. So before you read the points on the left-hand side, I saw this graph, and it sort of, whilst it cemented a few things for me, it has also still really surprised me. If you look at the very bottom of the graph, this is based on the age in months of the cars and the profile which are selling at auction, not just with us, but at auction nationally. And you can see that cars that are less than 12 months old since 2003, so the bottom of the graph, that blue figure, is basically non-existent from 2018 to 2021. There's a blip in 2020, and that's the COVID where everyone was defleeting, trying to cash up and prepare. So that's a bit of an outlier there. And a lot of that is the makeup in the changing of the government fleets. But what really surprises me is you look at, say, anything that's 2 years old at auction, and you look at, say, 2003, for instance, 60% of the market was made up of cars that are less than 2 years old. So we look at the market now and say, why is it so hard to get a new car? Well, you can't get anything that's it's very difficult, particularly with auctions, which are selling combined probably 200,000 to 300,000 cars a year. You can't get anything that's, well, very difficult to get anything that's 2 years or less, and you can't get a new stock. So what's happening to all these cars? Where are cars that are 12 months old? Where are they going? And that's why I'm sort of a little bit perplexed as to, I just find that graph amazing at the moment. But the normal trends which are happening. I do have a question on stats and insolvency, and are we seeing more activity? I'll get to that in a second. And I think that question is very timely, because I think that is where the cars that are going to be that less than 2 years old are going to happen. I think that is where 2 years of inactivity in collection has meant that, and the change in government policy has meant that those cars just don't exist on the second-hand market like they used to be. So here's a little bit of a snapshot of just some of the cars with, you can see the kilometre readings there, the new price and the percentages, and you can see, you know, Toyota Hilux, it's the right product, the right time, is bringing new price. Arguably, well, not arguably, at 100,000 Ks, that is where there's a psychological barrier for people that they have to sell cars, or they won't buy one which is 100,000 Ks. What's interesting, I find, about that is in America, it's at 100,000 miles, which is 160,000 kilometers. So it's just this psychological number which we as consumers can't really break, particularly when you've got that example in the US of 100,000 miles. But here's one which you could say arguably at 100,000 Ks, the car's had its first life. Here's one which is almost at the end of its second life, which is bringing 100% new price, which again, that sort of stuff is astounding, but you know, it's been very well publicized. We put in some of these prestige type cars just so that we can see what the top end of the market is doing. Even though that there's been some recent blips in, say, equities, crypto, those things, a lot of these values will normally be tied into, say, particularly in those Lamborghinis, will be Lamborghinis, Ferraris, that really heavy high-end car. When you value them, it's not necessarily so much about comparisons, what's sold in the last 3 or 6 months. It's more about what's happening in property prices, what the investment bank bonuses are, equities in particular, so that people sort of, when they have this paper money, they'll go out and they'll buy those sorts of cars as a bit of a toy or a reward, and they are still strong. And that sort of leads me to think that there's still a little bit of confidence in the market, and people are still happy to pay sort of big prices for those luxury items. So this is a slide which we've kept, other than just adding the part which is from 2021. So in the last quarterly report, you probably would have seen this slide, and this was the prediction. You know, outlook for 2022, we were going, well, supply chain issues are going to normalize and catch up by mid to late 2022. Is that going to happen? I think that probably with the shutdowns in China, that's going to blow out a little bit. I also think that I'm pretty sure we can be forgiven for not predicting the war in Europe, but that is going to have an impact on different asset values, depending on whether it's agriculture or whether it's auto. A lot of the German manufacturers do actually get their supply out of Ukraine, so you know, how's that going to impact our supply? And I think that will blow things out. We did think that international borders were going to open up, so whilst we've got some of these things right, there is some normalization. There is still going to be a bit of a blowout because of those geopolitical issues. If, for instance, there is another geopolitical area, you know, Taiwan, they produce most of the semiconductor chips, which I haven't touched most on that because most of you are well aware of it, but that semiconductor chip, Taiwan is the biggest producer of those in the world, and so that will change absolutely everything. If that's the case, you can start to see the US is strategically getting back into semiconductor chips just as a bit of a hedge against Taiwan. So that's what we predicted in 2021. So what are we looking at in 2022 for the rest of this year. You know, the economy is expected to grow. You know, we do have a buoyant secondary market. We do have banks who are willing to continue that lending and that ease of capital. So there is plenty of confidence there. But there is going to be the increase in interest rates. We've seen that. Most of the banks have priced that into their rates already, and obviously the inflation pressure. So what does that mean? And I'm going to combine this with the next point and to the question from Chris around the insolvency rates. The insolvency rates for the last sort of 2 years, have been sort of 50% of where they normally are. And so I think that return of the normal business pressures of, you know, if your rent's due, you have to pay it. If you've got creditors, you need to pay it. If you've got an ATO debt, they're getting far more aggressive now. So they've issued notices which are, if you haven't paid your debt or you're not engaging with us, we're going to issue you with a director penalty notice. And that DPN, director penalty notice, that DPN actually makes as a director, makes your personal assets available to the ATO. So there is a bit more of that pressure around having to pay your debts as and when they fall due. So there will be this return to the long-term average, which is about 8,500 insolvencies annually. That's down to about 4,500. So that is going to increase, which will see a lot of assets come around. There is going to be, I think, and we've seen it recently with a couple of files that have been at branch land within the banks, and it's there as performing, and then it goes from performing to essentially shut down without any visibility really, really quickly. There was a multi-million-dollar fleet just recently, which has been sold as a result, and so there will be this uncovering of some pain, and I think that's going to happen in the second half of this year, which is going to be something which we all need to be aware of, and where you can go back to your clients. So I think the provisioning and things will be far more required in the second half of this year, far more than in the first half. So I think asset prices will hold up. The market will turn, particularly in the heavy trucks, but I don't think that is within 12 months. I think the market is going to remain strong. There's a seasonal decrease in the auto, which happens typically after Easter. That will be less this year than it has in previous years. So just wanted to try and have something which is useful for you guys when you go back. The other question I've got is, are we expecting lead times to come down or get worse over the next 12 months for heavy trucks? I don't think they're going to get worse. I think even though we've got the highest per capita COVID infection rates, I think there is that COVID fatigue at the moment, and people just want to get back to work and normal life, and they're happy to take the risk of getting COVID and dealing with it. That has impacted manufacturers to the point of, will it get better or worse? I actually think that it will get better. I don't think they're going to bring lead times back to less than, say, 6 months in new trucks, because they're not really incentivized to do that. If you're a manufacturer, you kind of want a 6-month plus lead time so that you can have, you can get your operational or your manufacturing efficiencies, and that your dealerships are stocked and those things. I don't think that it will get back to, say, 3 months. I think it is going to be 6 to 12 months for the foreseeable future is my prediction in that. So I don't really have any more slides to present. If you do want to shoot through some questions, I've got my phone open now, or you can type it into the box. Otherwise, we will look to end the session. We'll give it a couple of minutes just in case. But otherwise, thank you everyone for attending. The quarterly report will go out on Friday morning. I'm getting a nod of the head, so you should it should be hitting your inbox Friday morning. If you do need to reach out to us for anything. Please feel free. Please feel free to send it through. I've just got another picture through, not very helpful as a question, but it is a photo. But thank you everyone for attending. I'll let you get back to your day, but reach out if you do need any help with anything.